Itchenstoke Hall, the South Library, in the soft Hampshire afternoon of the 4th of November 1819, my dear Lavinia, I write to you, my dearest niece by marriage, what I have meant to write these 28 years, and have not had the patience to set down before the matter has required. Dr. Wickham of Winchester has been at the long autumnal decline of his patience these 4 months past with the matter of my heart. He gives me, in his careful Winchester wisdom, until the close of December at the most. I write therefore at the soft Hampshire November afternoon, and shall ask Mr. Penlow of College Street to lay this letter at your hand at the Itchenabas parsonage at his proper time after probate. You shall have heard of me only in passing. Your late uncle, Mr. Marmaduke Kemble, was my own husband, Sir Hadrian's younger brother. The two parted at Sir Hadrian's marriage in 1788. My own father-in-law, the Reverend Octavius Kemble of Andover, having taken in the matter the part I cannot now press the dust upon. The matter has weighed upon me these 9 years since Sir Hadrian's burial in the south churchyard of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke. What I wish you to know, in this letter that is in form, no part of the legal will Mr. Penlow shall read in Winchester at his proper time, is the settled wish of an old great-aunt who has not in 28 years come over the 6 Hampshire chalk-stream miles to your father's parsonage. By the will Mr. Penlow shall read, you are sole heiress to Itchenstoke Hall. The house, 156 acres, the walled south garden, the apple and pear orchard, the south library, the Kemble family plate, and £3,250 in the 3 per cents. I have followed your pianoforte playing at the parsonage these 4 years, through Reverend Carberry's gentle Sunday accounts. The Handel annotations you have kept in the worn calf volumes are very fine, my dear Lavinia. Mr. Vincent Novello of the Spanish Embassy Chapel holds the same opinion. I wish to think that the 1809 Broadwood Square piano at the South Library at Itchenstoke shall be at your hand from the spring of 1820 onwards. It has stood in the South Library since I obtained it from Broadwood at London in March 1809, and was restored by Mr. Stoddart of London in October 1813. It has wanted a careful keeper since old Mrs. Tewkesbury, my late music mistress, was taken in the October of 1817. Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Sandys at the home pasture, Mr. Aubrey at the south door, and the Reverend Carberry at the parish living of St. Mary's. These are the people who shall receive you. They are honest and kind, and have served me well. I am sorry that I have not in your 28 years come over the 6 Hampshire chalk-stream miles between us. The matter weighed too long. The asking pardon of an old great-aunt at the close of her time is the only asking pardon at her hand to give. Your loving great-aunt, Cassandra Kemble. P.S. At the South Library writing table you shall find my own dark calf, annotated copy of the Handel oratorios in 6 volumes, Walsh, London 1787, and my Haydn creation, Breitkopf 1800 Leipzig. They are for your hand. C.K. On the Hampshire morning of Wednesday, the 22nd of December, 1819, Lavinia Kemble was at the small Clementi pianoforte at the south parlour of the Itchenabas parsonage, playing through the Handel air, O Ruddier Than the Cherry, from Assis and Galatea. Lavinia Kemble was gentle, 5 feet 5, soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, warm hazel eyes the colour of summer honey, fair Hampshire chalk-stream complexion, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt, the testatrix. The mourning had been put on the 2nd week of December, when the post from Itchenstoke Hall had carried word that the great-aunt she had never met was at the long decline her physician had foretold. The word of the death itself had come on the 15th. There had been the funeral at St. Mary's of Itchenstoke on the 19th, at which she had not been. Her father had ridden over alone, the day having lain heavy upon him, and had come back at the dusk with the small note from Mrs. Burwood, and very little else. The south parlour was a small panelled room with a single south-facing sash and a green baize writing table at the centre, and the Clementi pianoforte against the east wall. Her father had bought the Clementi for her in the spring of 1812, when she was 21, and her playing had outgrown the parsonage spinet that had been her mother's. The instrument was a plain mahogany square, 4 octaves and a fifth, with the maker's brass cartouche above the keys. It stood near the south sash, where the morning light could be had at the score, and she kept the worn, dark calf-handle volumes upon the small shelf above it. Walsh, London, 1787, 6 volumes, the gift of her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Kemble. Above the Walsh handle sat her own green calf music journal, which she had kept since 1815 in her careful italic. Page 47 was her annotations upon the Acis and Galatea air she was at this morning, the long descending bass figure under O Ruddier Than the Cherry, which Mr. Vincent Novello of the Spanish Embassy Chapel at London had written her of in the spring of 1818. Page 89 was her Messiah trumpet air. The journal sat closed upon the music shelf, the green ribbon marking the Acis page. She had taken the air through twice in the slow tempo Mr. Novello held to be the proper Handel reading. With the long ornament at the third bar, she had set down at page 47. She had taken it through a third time at the brisker tempo Mr. Crotch of Oxford preferred, and had marked at the journal edge that she could not, upon a long winter's reflection, agree with Mr. Crotch. The bass figure asked for the slower hand. She was at the cadence of the third reading when the hoof-beat of a hired chaise drew up at the south door along the gravel sweep. Mrs. Lacey, the parsonage maid, came in at the parlour door a moment after, with a folded card upon a pewter salver. The card was Mr. Penlow's. He had come over from Winchester in a hired chaise from the King's Arms, and asked at the south door whether Miss Kemble might be at home to receive the matter he had carried over from probate. Lavinia rose at the Clementi, and closed the Walsh handle Volume 4 upon the Acis air. The Reverend Augustus Kemble, her widowed father, was at the rectory study at the north end of the parsonage when Mrs. Lacey took the card in. He had been curate of St. Swithin's of Ichenabas since 1798, and was now near 70 in his plain weekday black. He came along the passage at the maid's word, and met Lavinia at the parlour threshold with the quiet courtesy of a man who would not press upon the matter, but would be at hand if he were called. Mrs. Lacey then showed Mr. Penlow in. He was the Winchester solicitor of College Street, whose name had been at the foot of the executor's letter of the 17th, a spare gentleman of 60, gold spectacles, plain dark wool. He carried a stout leather portfolio under his arm and a sealed packet at his coat. He bowed to Lavinia at the green baize, inclined his head at the Reverend Augustus at the parlour door, and laid the portfolio at the corner of the baize. Lavinia took the chair at the east of the writing table, Mr. Penlow the chair opposite. Her father did not come in. He stood by his own quiet wish, just at the half-open door, his hand resting at the jamb, his head a little inclined. The Hampshire silence the matter asked of him was the silence he gave. The fire had been kept low through the morning. Mrs. Lacey set fresh coals at it as Mr. Penlow drew his portfolio open at the baize. Mr. Penlow drew the sealed packet from beneath his coat and laid it upon the green baize. The seal was the Kemble seal, red wax, lately broken at his own chambers at College Street, and refastened with a thin tape for the carrying. He set his hand at the cover, looked once at Lavinia, and at her small composed nod began to read aloud. He read in the even voice of a solicitor who would not hurry the gravity of the page. He read the date and the South Library at Itchenstoke Hall, where the letter had been written. He read the 28 years' silence. He read the matter of Dr. Wickham and the close of December. He read the parting at Sir Hadrian's marriage of 1788 and the Reverend Octavius Kemble of Andover, and the part the old man had taken. He read the gift of Itchenstoke Hall, the house and the 156 acres, and the walled south garden, and the orchard, and the south library, and the Kemble family plate, and the £3,250 in the 3%. He read the 4 years of Sunday accounts of the parsonage pianoforte, and Mr. Vincent Novello of the Spanish Embassy Chapel, and the steady keeper the Broadwood had wanted since old Mrs. Tewkesbury. He read the 4 named servants who should receive her at Itchenstoke, and at the close he read the 6 Hampshire chalk-stream miles of the road between Itchenstoke and the parsonage, and the asking pardon of an old great-aunt at the close of her time. He read the signature and the postscript of the Walsh 1787 handle and the Breitkopf 1800 creation, and laid the letter at the green baize. Lavinia sat very still. She had folded her hands in her lap. She did not weep. She had wept her small portion in the 2nd week of December, when the word of the decline had come, and again at the night of the 19th, when her father had ridden back from the funeral. She said only, after a small interval, that she was much obliged to Mr. Penlow for the long ride and the steady reading. Mr. Penlow inclined his head. At the parlour door, her father said nothing at all. He had taken from his coat pocket the small white handkerchief that had been her mother's, and held it folded between his fingers, and after a moment put it back. The 28 years' silence between Itchenstoke Hall and the parsonage had pressed upon him too. He let it pass in the Hampshire silence the matter asked. Mr. Penlow then produced from the inner pocket of his coat 6 further items, which he set upon the green baize one after the other, naming each. The first was a clean copy of the will, signed at his own hand at College Street upon the 20th of December, sealed and tied with the same thin tape. It set out in legal form what the great-aunt's letter had said in plain words. The second was a brass ring, carrying 5 household keys. Mrs. Burwood at Itchenstoke had sent it by Mr. Penlow's clerk on the morning of the 21st. Mr. Penlow named them as he passed the ring across: the south door key of the hall, the walled south garden key, the south library key, the family plate-room key, and the small key of the steward's strong cupboard at Mr. Sandys's office. The ring lay heavy upon the baize, the 5 keys ranged along the brass in the order Mrs. Burwood had set them. The third was a banker's draft upon the Bank of England for £3,250, drawn at Mr. Penlow's hand upon the executor's account, to be paid into the 3% at Lavinia's order on her arrival at Winchester. The fourth was the calling card of the Reverend Carberry, the parish curate of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke since 1814, 51, plain black gown. He had asked Mr. Penlow to leave his card in token that he should be at her hand at any matter of the parish when she came over to the hall. The fifth was a card she had not looked for, that of his lordship Wilfrid Algernon Mainwaring, 5th Viscount Mainwaring, of Mainwaring Park, 6 miles east on the Hampshire chalk stream above Easton. Mr. Penlow explained that the late Mrs. Kemble had asked him in November to leave the Viscount's card among the papers, his lordship being lay patron of the Itchenstoke living since 1817, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Musicians these 5 years past, and having shown at the parish school inspection of the September past a particular interest in the South Library, Walsh handle annotations Mrs. Kemble had kept these many years. Lord Wilfrid had not been told of the letter. The card was left only that Lavinia should know who at the parish was her neighbour. The sixth was a smaller sealed letter, addressed in Mrs. Kemble's own hand to the Reverend Augustus Kemble at the Itchen parsonage. It was a mourning letter, Mr. Penlow said. He had been asked to lay it at the Reverend Augustus's hand at the same hour as the larger letter. He did not open it. He passed it across the baize to Lavinia, that she might give it to her father at his own time. Mr. Penlow then rose. He was, he said, much obliged to Miss Kemble for the offer of luncheon, and would take a small portion of cold meat and bread at the steward's parlour before the ride back. Mrs. Lacey was sent at the kitchen to lay a luncheon at the back of the parsonage, and Mr. Penlow bowed to Lavinia and to the Reverend Augustus and went out at the maid's lead. He took his luncheon with a glass of small beer Mrs. Lacey set at his hand, and was at the chaise again within the hour. He had a probate matter at College Street he could not put off another day, and the 6 miles to Winchester was a steady ride at the December lanes. Lavinia stood at the south sash and watched him take the gravel sweep. The chaise went west along the Winchester road and was lost behind the bend at the Chalk Stream Bridge. She brought the small morning letter to her father at the parlour door. She did not stay. She went out at the kitchen passage to give him the room. Her father took the letter at his hand and stood a moment with it. Then he came in at the south parlour and sat at the green baize where Mr. Penlow had sat, and broke the seal with the small ivory paper knife that had been his own father's. The letter from the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble to the Reverend Augustus Kemble was short. It spoke of the 28 years' silence between the parsonage and Itchenstoke Hall, and of the part the late Reverend Octavius Kemble of Andover had taken at Sir Hadrian's marriage in 1788, which had set the silence. It spoke of the writer's own long agreement with that part. It asked his pardon, the asking pardon of an old great-aunt at the close of her time. It said that she had been at his and Mrs. Sarah Kemble's wedding at St. Mary's of Itchenstoke on the 5th of June, 1791, although he would not have known her there. It asked that he should think of her now in the small daily portion of his prayers, and not more. The Reverend Augustus Kemble read it twice. He folded it and set it upon the green baize, his hand flat upon it, and sat for a long moment at the writing table without speaking. Then he laid the small white handkerchief over it, the way he had laid the prayer book over a fresh grave at St. Swithin's many a time. And after another small interval, he rose and went out at the parlour door, and was at the small north window of his study for the rest of the afternoon. Lavinia took her green calf music journal from the music shelf, and went out at the kitchen passage to the parsonage garden, where the December air had a thin chalk stream sense to it, and the leafless apple tree at the south wall stood at its winter shape. She walked the gravel path twice and came back in, and Mrs. Lacey set a cup of tea at her hand at the kitchen table without a word. She did not open the journal. The bees of the matter, as her old music mistress had used to say, would settle in their own hour. Evening prayers at the Itchen parsonage were said at the small east end of the south parlour at the close of the day. Her father read them as he had read them every evening of her life. He took the psalter at the lectern. She sat at the small carved chair by the fire. Mrs. Lacey stood at the door. He read the proper psalm for the Wednesday before Christmas, and the small collect, and the prayer for the dead lately gone before. He named no name. The silence at the place a name might have been was filled, in the Hampshire way, by the pause itself. When the prayer was done and Mrs. Lacey had gone out, Lavinia did not at once leave the parlour. She rose from the small carved chair by the fire and went over to the Clementi at the east wall and drew the Walsh Handel Volume 4 from the music shelf and opened it again at the Arcis page. Her father, who had set the psalter at the lectern, watched her without speaking. He knew his daughter's hand at the Clementi. He had known it these 8 years. He took the chair at the green baize and let her have the parlour. Lavinia played the air through one more time. She played it at the slow tempo Mr. Novello held to be the proper Handel reading, with the long ornament at the third bar she had set down at page 47 of the journal, and the long descending bass figure under O, ruddier than the cherry, given its full weight. She did not hurry the cadence. She knew at the close of the third bar of the second strain that the air was the last she would finish at the Clementi at Itchen that the next playing of the Handel oratorios at her hand should be at the 1809 Broadwood Square piano at the South Library at Itchenstoke, and that the small Clementi at the south parlour of the parsonage would stand silent at the south sash from the morning she set out. She let the air close in its own time, and laid her hand flat upon the keys a moment, and closed the Walsh Handel Volume 4 upon the page. She took the green calf music journal from the shelf and brought it to the green baize. She drew the small lead pencil from the inkstand and turned to the back page where she meant to write the day. She wrote the entry in her steady italic, just as Mr. Vincent Novello of the Spanish Embassy Chapel had once written that a player's journal ought to be kept, Acis and Galatea, oh ruddier than the cherry. Wednesday, 22nd December, 1819, Ichenabus South Parlour, Clementi Pianoforte. Mr. Penlow's letter at the South Parlour this afternoon. She blotted the entry with the small square of green felt and closed the journal upon the page. Her father, at the green baize, had watched the writing without speaking. He set his hand at her wrist a moment as she closed the journal and inclined his head, and said only that he should miss the small Clementi hour at the parsonage when she was gone. On the Monday following, the 27th of December, the day after the small St. Stephen's morning service, Reverend Augustus had said at St. Swithin's, Lavinia sat at the green baize at the South Parlour and wrote out, in the steady italic of her music journal, her acceptance of Mr. Penlow's instruction. She would come over to Itchenstoke Hall by hired chaise from Winchester on the Saturday 3 Saturdays following, which was the 8th of January 1820. She would receive the household at the south door at the hand of Mr. Aubrey the butler and Mrs. Burwood the housekeeper. She would meet with Mr. Penlow at College Street on the Tuesday following her arrival to have the will read formally and the £3,250 paid into the 3%. And she would call upon the Reverend Carberry at the parish of St. Mary's at the first Sunday of her residence. She sealed the letter with her own small plain wax. She had no Kemble seal of her own, the Kemble seal having been her great-aunt's, and gave it to Mrs. Lacey for the evening post. The leafless apple tree at the south wall of the parsonage garden was a small clean shape against the late December sky. The Clementi at the South Parlour stood silent at the south sash. The Walsh Handel Volume 4 was closed upon the music shelf. The green calf music journal lay at the green baize with the entry of the 22nd at the back page. The Hampshire silence. The close of December asked of the parsonage was the silence the parsonage gave. Saturday, the 8th of January, 1820, came up over the Hampshire chalk stream country in a still grey light, a light without wind, the kind of January light that lays itself upon the honeystone of the Ichenabus parsonage, and the pale tile of the rectory roof, and the small leafless orchard behind the rectory garden in one settled, even hand. Lavinia Kemble, 28, in her unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix, her soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, her hazel eyes the colour of summer honey, stood at the south door of the parsonage with her father, the Reverend Augustus Kemble, curate of St. Swithin's of Ichenabus these 22 years, while Mr. Sandys's brougham, sent over from Itchenstoke the evening before, was brought round upon the gravel. Her 2 corded travelling trunks had been set down by the parsonage manservant the previous afternoon, and were already at the boot. The small Clementi pianoforte of 1812 at the South Parlour, the instrument upon which she had played the Handel air of Acis and Galatea the afternoon Mr. Penlow arrived, was to remain at Ichenabus at the South Parlour at her father's hand for his evening hymns. Reverend Augustus had asked it. Lavinia had assented in one quiet sentence at evening prayers the Wednesday past. She kissed her father at the south door of the parsonage, took the steward's hand at the brougham step, and was handed up to the cushion under the lap rug of grey Hampshire wool. The brougham turned out of the parsonage gate at the half-hour and took the lane east toward the Itchen and the 6 miles of chalk stream country lying between the parsonage and Itchenstoke Hall. The lane east from Ichenabus runs first along the north shoulder of the River Itchen at the Low Water Meadow, then bends northeast at the parish boundary of Easton on the Itchen, where the King's Head Inn stands at the bridge, the old coaching inn of pale chalk stone with its yard of stamped chalk and its sign of a chestnut head above the door, kept by Mr. Henshaw, the innkeeper, these 11 years past. Here, the brougham was drawn up for the change of the offside horse at the King's Head Yard, the change occupying no great while at the practised hand of Mr. Henshaw's ostler, and Lavinia took at the inn parlour a single dish of warm tea and a slice of brown bread with the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Henshaw, in a quiet exchange of 3 sentences. After which Mr. Sandys's brougham was brought round again to the King's Head door, and the road taken northeast along the chalk stream toward the Itchenstoke parish boundary, the river running quiet at the south meadow, the leafless orchards of the chalk stream farms at either hand, the pale Hampshire sky lying even upon the low ridges, until the brougham turned in at the south lodge of Itchenstoke Hall and ran up the curve of the avenue of pollarded limes, leafless in their January boughs, to the south front of the Honeystone Manor of 1748. The south door of Itchenstoke Hall opened upon the gravel sweep as the brougham drew up, and Mr. Aubrey the butler, Mr. Aubrey, 58, plain black tailcoat, plain white linen at the throat, with the household keys upon a small brass ring at his waist, came down the 3 shallow stone steps in measured manner and received Miss Kemble at the brougham step with a bow of practised quietness and the verbatim sentence, "Miss Kemble, your great-aunt's household are at your hand." Mrs. Burwood, the housekeeper, 56, in plum bombazine and the fluted lace cap of her station, was waiting at the inner south hall, under the painted oval of Sir Hadrian Kemble, the 3rd Baronet, 1745 to 1811, and curtsied at the proper depth as Lavinia was shown in, and said in her plain Hampshire manner, "Miss Kemble, the late Mrs. Kemble's south chamber has been made up at your settled wish." Mr. Sandys, the steward, 60, weathered plain dark coat over plain dark waistcoat, the small leather rent book of the home pasture upon his right arm, was at the south hall step at Mrs. Burwood's shoulder, and offered the verbatim sentence, "Miss Kemble, the home pasture and the rent book are at your hand whenever you shall wish to look upon them." Lavinia gave each of the 3 her quiet thanks, in the plain Hampshire fashion of the parsonage, and was conducted up the south staircase to the late great-aunt's south chamber, where her 2 travelling trunks had already been carried up, and where Mrs. Burwood's niece Damaris had laid out the unrelieved black bombazine for the evening. By the inventory Mr. Penlow had read at the parsonage the Wednesday before Christmas, Itchenstoke Hall stood at 156 acres of home pasture, and walled south garden of half an acre, with 384 volumes upon the south library shelves, catalogued in the late Mrs. Kemble's own italic hand under the 8 headings of divinity, history, voyages, poetry, drama, natural philosophy, music, and letters, together with the 78 pieces of the Kemble family plate, assayed at Winchester in 1789, under the Winchester mark of Mr. Coppinger, the assay master, and itemized in Mrs. Burwood's plate book under the 4 headings of dinner plate, tea plate, communion plate loaned to the parish at St. Mary's, and small personal plate, and £3,250 in the 3% consolidated annuities of the Bank of England, standing at the late Mrs. Kemble's name, and now at the name of Miss Lavinia Mary Kemble of Itchenstoke Hall, by the entry of Mr. Penlow of College Street, Winchester, in the probate registry of the Consistory Court of Winchester, under the 7th day of January, 1820. These figures Lavinia had read at the parsonage, and read again at the South Library writing table upon her arrival, and she set them aside without comment as her father had counselled at evening prayers, the figures being the lesser part of the matter, in the settled wisdom of the late Reverend Augustus's 22 parsonage years. From the south library window, the long stone-mullioned south window of the 1748 manor, divided into 8 lights of pale Hampshire glass, Lavinia looked out upon the south meadow of Itchenstoke and saw the river Itchen running quiet at the meadow edge, the chalk stream clear over its pale gravel bed, the willow stumps pollarded at the south bank in the practised hand of Mr. Sandys. Beyond the river, the Hampshire chalk stream ridge rose to the south in long, pale, chalky shoulders, dotted with the small flocks of the Itchenstoke home pasture. And at the east, where the south library gave upon the orchard walk through a second mullioned window, the apple and pear orchard ran in 20 long rows of leafless January boughs down to the kitchen garden wall. The pruning of the orchard already at 3/4 under Mr. Sandys's autumn hand, the pollarded heads of the older Hampshire apples still showing the chalk mark of last Michaelmas. The whole prospect, taken at the South Library upon the still grey light of the January afternoon, was the prospect her late great-aunt, Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, had looked upon at the same South Library window every January of the 31 years since her marriage in 1788, and Lavinia stood at the window for the space of 1 slow minute and took it in. She turned then to the South Library proper, and at the long inner wall, the wall between the south windows and the small north door of the writing closet, she came upon the instrument the sealed letter had named. It was the 1809 Broadwood square piano of London, the rosewood case set upon 4 turned legs of figured mahogany, the small brass plate at the keyboard bearing the inscription Broadwood and Sons, London, 1809, and at the inner soundboard the second brass plate of the Restorer of 1813, restored by Mr. Stoddart of London, October 1813. The instrument stood at the South Library, as it had stood since March 1809, when Mrs. Cassandra Kemble had obtained it of Broadwood at London. The dark walnut music stand was raised at its proper angle, the inner felt of the lid was unfrayed, the brass candle arms at either side of the keyboard were polished against tarnish in Mrs. Burwood's plain Hampshire hand. Lavinia drew off her travelling gloves, set them upon the music stand, and laid her right hand at the keyboard. She struck the C above middle C, and after it the G above, and after the G the upper C, in the practised parsonage manner her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Kemble, had taught her at the age of 7. The 3 notes spoke true. They were still tuned. The instrument had not been touched these 3 months by any other hand, and yet the notes spoke true at her own first hand. Mrs. Burwood, who had come up behind her at the South Library door with the lamp, said in her plain Hampshire voice that the late Mrs. Kemble had had Mr. Stoddart over from London at the South Library the October of 1819, 4 weeks before her death of the heart at the close of December, to lay the practised hand of the restorer upon the keys of the Broadwood a final time, that the instrument should be tuned at the hand of Mr. Stoddart against the hand of the next mistress of the house, whichever hand that should be. The late Mrs. Kemble had said it at the South Library to Mrs. Burwood that October afternoon, 4 weeks before her death of the heart. Lavinia stood at the Broadwood for the space of 1 breath, and said nothing. Mrs. Burwood came up to the South Library the morning following with the small mahogany box from the late Mrs. Kemble's writing closet, and set the box upon the South Library table, and lifted out the 6 worn dark-calf volumes of the Walsh 1787 London edition of Handel's Oratorios, together with the heavier folio of the Breitkopf 1800 Leipzig Die Schöpfung of Joseph Haydn, all of which had stood at the late Mrs. Kemble's writing closet shelf these many years past, and were now to stand at the South Library Broadwood at Miss Kemble's hand by the postscript of the sealed letter. Mrs. Burwood placed them at the writing table in her plain Hampshire manner, and withdrew. The week following at Itchenstoke ran in the quiet rhythm Mrs. Burwood and Mr. Sandys had settled at the household over the late Mrs. Kemble's last years. Lavinia walked the home pasture with Mr. Sandys upon the Monday and Tuesday mornings. She looked over the plate book with Mrs. Burwood upon the Monday afternoon. She read the 3% annuity papers at the South Library writing table upon the Tuesday afternoon and laid them aside in Mr. Penlow's plain manila wrapper for the Winchester Post. Upon the Wednesday, the 12th day of January 1820, at the middle of the morning, came up the drive at the South Lodge a one-horse hired chaise from Andover, and at the chaise step descended a thin, sandy clerk of perhaps 30 in plain pepper and salt wool, who came up to the south door upon his own feet and presented Mr. Aubrey at the south porch with a single-folded calling card upon plain stiff white pasteboard, edged in plain black, lettered in plain copper-plate engraving, Sir Bartholomew Northmore, 4th Baronet Northmore of Northmore Hall, near Andover, Hampshire, and folded with the card a single half-sheet of plain cream wove, sealed with a small wafer of plain dull red, and lettered upon the outer fold in the same copper-plate hand to Miss Lavinia Kemble of Itchenstoke Hall, preliminary. The clerk, who gave his name as Mr. Andover Clerk, of Sir Bartholomew's chambers at Andover, did not enter the porch beyond the inner step, did not accept Mr. Aubrey's offer of small ale at the steward's pantry, did not ask to be presented to Miss Kemble. He stated to Mr. Aubrey at the south porch the single sentence that the card and the note had been laid at Sir Bartholomew's settled wish at the south door of Itchenstoke Hall, and that Sir Bartholomew's chaise should be looked for at his own convenience upon some Wednesday following, and he then withdrew to the hired chaise and was driven down the avenue of pollarded limes. Mr. Aubrey carried the card and the folded note up the south staircase to the South Library, where Lavinia was at the writing table over the morning's Winchester Post, and laid them upon the inlaid leather of the table at her right hand, and stood back at the proper distance. Lavinia broke the small wafer of dull red, and unfolded the half-sheet of plain cream wove. The note within was in the same plain copper-plate engraved hand as the card, not in Sir Bartholomew's own hand, lettered evidently at the chambers of Mr. Lanesborough at Andover by a hired clerk. It contained the 4 lines: Miss Kemble, Sir Bartholomew Northmore, 4th Baronet, presents his compliments to the new mistress of Itchenstoke Hall, and requests the favour of a private interview at the South Library at Sir Bartholomew's own convenience upon some Wednesday following the present. The matter under consideration touching the settled wishes of the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, deceased in the months immediately preceding her decease. Beneath the 4 lines stood the plain engraved subscription, Lanesborough of Andover, for Sir Bartholomew Northmore, 4th Baronet. Beneath that, the single date, 12th January, 1820, Andover. Lavinia read the 4 lines through twice at the South Library writing table in the still Hampshire silence of the late great-aunt's house, and laid the half-sheet at her right hand upon the inlaid leather of the table at the corner of the Winchester Post. She did not change colour in the practised parsonage composure of her 22 Itchenabers years. She did not speak at any length to Mr. Aubrey at the proper distance. She said in the plain Hampshire fashion of the parsonage, "Mr. Aubrey, the card and the note shall go down by the evening post to Mr. Penlow at College Street, Winchester. I shall write a covering line at this table within the half-hour. Mr. Sandys' brougham shall stand at the south door at the proper hand of the evening post." Mr. Aubrey bowed at the proper distance and withdrew. She wrote at the South Library writing table in her own quiet italic the covering line to Mr. Penlow, College Street, Winchester. "Sir, I forward at the evening post the calling card and the preliminary note dropped this morning by Sir Bartholomew Northmore's clerk at the south door of Itchenstoke Hall. The note proposes a private interview at the South Library at Sir Bartholomew's own convenience upon some Wednesday following the present. The matter, as set out in the note, touching the settled wishes of the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble in the months immediately preceding her decease." I shall be guided by your considered advice at College Street upon the proper hand to be given to Sir Bartholomew's preliminary, and upon the day at which the private interview, should one be admitted, may best be received at the South Library. I am, sir, at your settled hand, Lavinia Mary Kemble, Itchenstoke Hall, 12th January, 1820. She folded the covering line about the calling card and the preliminary note, sealed the packet with a plain dull red wafer of her own black-bordered mourning set, lettered the outer fold in her own italic, Mr. Penlow, College Street, Winchester, by the hand of Mr. Sandys's brougham at the Evening Post, and laid the packet at the corner of the inlaid leather for Mr. Aubrey. The packet went down by the Evening Post that same Wednesday from Itchenstoke South Door to the Winchester General Post Office at the proper hand of the Evening Post. The first Sunday of Lavinia's residence at Itchenstoke Hall, Sunday the 9th of January, 1820, the Sunday following the Saturday 8th, fell at the second Sunday of Epiphany in the parish calendar of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke on the Itchen, and Lavinia walked down with Mrs. Burwood and Mr. Aubrey at her two attendants through the home pasture to the parish church at the meadow's edge, where the Reverend Carberry, 51, the curate of St. Mary's at the patronage of Lord Wilfrid Menwaring of Menwaring Park, plain black gown, plain white bands at the throat, preached at the south pulpit the Epiphany sermon upon the manifestation of the light of Christ to the Gentiles at the visit of the Magi. The sermon taking its text from St. Matthew the 2nd chapter, the 11th verse, and when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother. And laying out at the plain Hampshire pulpit, in the Reverend Carberry's settled Sunday manner, the small reflection that the Magi had come from far countries upon a settled wish, and had found at the end of the journey the small house at Bethlehem, and that the parish of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke was in its own small way every Sunday morning a small Bethlehem of the chalk stream country, where the settled wish of the parish met the settled wish of the light at the south porch of the parish church, the sermon being received at the pews of the parish in the quiet Hampshire attention of the second Sunday of Epiphany, and Lavinia took her place at the south pew of the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble in her unrelieved black mourning bonnet at the practised parsonage composure of her 22 parsonage years. She walked back up through the home pasture at the close of morning service in the still grey January light, Mrs. Burwood at one shoulder and Mr. Aubrey at the other, the river Itchen running quiet at the south meadow at her right hand, the chalk stream ridge rising to the south at the further bank, the apple and pear orchard standing leafless at the east upon her left at the kitchen garden wall, and came up at the south door of the Honeystone Manor of 1748 at the practised hand of her late great-aunt's household, and was received at the south porch by Mr. Aubrey at the proper distance, and went up the south staircase to the late great-aunt's south chamber to lay aside her bonnet against the Sunday cold collation Mrs. Burwood had set out at the small south parlour. The Broadwood Square piano of 1809 at the South Library, restored by Mr. Stoddart of London in October 1813, tuned a final time by Mr. Stoddart at the late Mrs. Kemble's settled wish in the October of 1819, stood silent at the long inner wall of the South Library that Sunday afternoon, the music stand raised at its proper angle, the brass candle arms polished at Mrs. Burwood's plain hand, the 6 worn dark-calf volumes of the Walsh 1787 handle, and the heavier folio of the Breitkopf 1800 Haydn Schöpfung, standing upon the South Library writing table at the right of the inlaid leather, against the hand of the new mistress of Itchenstoke Hall. The Wednesday of the 19th of January, 1820, came up over the Hampshire chalk stream country, in a thin grey light that lay along the south meadow at Itchenstoke, and along the dry stone wall of the home pasture beyond. The wind was out of the east. The Itchen ran low between its winter banks at the bottom of the meadow, and the apple and pear orchard at the east stood quiet under the hoar of an early frost that had not yet thawed, Lavinia Kemble had walked from the south parlour through the panelled hall to the south library at the inner end of the morning, and she had laid out at the writing table the 6 dark calf volumes of the Walsh 1787 London edition of the Handel Oratorios. She had laid them open in the order of their publication: Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, Volume 5, Volume 6, and she had set beside them her own annotated Handel book, the slim quarto in dark calf, with the gilt spine she had kept since the spring of 1815. She had set Mr. Stoddart of London's October 1813 restoration certificate at the inner end of the writing table, under a small brass paper weight, and she had laid beside it the leaf from Reverend Carberry's parish visit book that the curate had walked over from the rectory at the close of the breakfast hour to deliver into her hand. She had only the calling card Sir Bartholomew Northmore had dropped at the south door by his clerk the Wednesday previous, and the folded note Mr. Penlow had sent down from Winchester on the Friday following, in which the Winchester solicitor had said in his plain, even hand that he should be at her door before the interview and present at the South Library at the matter. The Penlow chaise from Winchester came up the South Drive that morning. Mr. Aubrey opened the south door. Mr. Penlow stepped down in his plain dark wool and his gold spectacles. He had brought up from Winchester his clerk, Mr. Inward, a lean man of 30 in dark grey wool, who took the side chair at the writing desk in the corner and set out his pen, his ink, and a folio of foolscap. "Miss Kemble," Mr. Penlow said in his plain, even voice, "I am content with the Handel. I am content with the restoration certificate. I am content with the parish visit leaf. Sir Bartholomew shall be at the south door this morning. Mr. Lanesborough of Lincoln's Inn shall be with him. I shall ask you to let him set out his matter at his own length, and I shall ask you to answer at the moment I incline at the table to you." "Mr. Penlow," Lavinia said, "I shall." Reverend Carberry came over from the rectory shortly after. He was a long, thin man of 51, in a plain black gown and plain bands. He had served the living of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke-on-the-Itchen these 17 years past, and he had been at Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's parlour window every Tuesday and Friday of the autumn of 1818 and the autumn of 1819, and he had kept his parish visit book in the small green ink of his plain Winchester hand. He bowed at the south library door. He took the second side chair at the writing table. "Miss Kemble," he said, "I am at your hand." "Reverend Carberry," she said, "I am much obliged." Mr. Aubrey came up to the south library door and announced at the panelled threshold, "Sir Bartholomew Northmore, 4th Baronet, of Northmore Hall, near Andover. Mr. Lanesborough of Lincoln's Inn, barrister." Sir Bartholomew Northmore stepped into the south library. He was a stout man of 53 at 5'10", gout-flushed at the cheeks under a high cravat, in a primrose silk waistcoat over a bottle-green morning coat and buff breeches. His brown wig was set close at the temples. He had an oily smile at the corner of his mouth and a folded paper in his right hand. Mr. Lanesborough came up at his elbow, a thin grey barrister of 60 in charcoal wool with a black leather folio at his left arm and a thin, even mouth that did not move at the small civility of the threshold. "Miss Kemble," Sir Bartholomew said, "I am much obliged at your hand." "Sir Bartholomew," Lavinia answered. "Mr. Lanesborough, pray be seated at the writing table. Mr. Penlow of College Street, Winchester, is at my hand. Reverend Carberry of the parish living is at my hand." Sir Bartholomew took the principal chair at the writing table. Mr. Lanesborough took the chair at his right. Mr. Lanesborough opened the black leather folio at the table and set out a folded paper and a pen and the small steel ink bottle he kept at the folio for the Lincoln's Inn travelling work he had been at these 34 years. "Miss Kemble," Mr. Lanesborough said in a thin grey voice, "I shall lay the matter at your leave." "Mr. Lanesborough," she said, "I am at the matter." Sir Bartholomew unfolded his paper at the table and laid it flat. He cleared his throat. He set the oily smile a little further at the corner of his mouth and inclined his head at her in the suburban courtesy he had brought down from Andover. "Miss Kemble," he began, "the matter is one of the most settled gravity. My late cousin, Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, did not, before her passing on of the 14th of December last, set out at her own hand to Mr. Penlow of Winchester the matter of the disposition by will. The matter has therefore come down at this hour to my own hand, and Mr. Lanesborough of Lincoln's Inn shall set out the legal frame, and I shall add the one matter of the parole that I have at my own recollection. The matter is an oral trust contracted at the south parlour of this very house at the afternoon of Monday the 14th of September, 1818, in which she undertook for half the estate of Itchenstoke to pass at her death to my own hand as the senior surviving cousin of the Kemble line on the disappointed Andover side, in consideration of the long and grievous matter of the 1788 misunderstanding." Mr. Lanesborough cleared his throat at the table. "Miss Kemble, the doctrine of the parole trust in respect of land, as set out at Lord Eldon's Chancery Reports in Tregwin against Tregwin of 1812, shall avail at Chancery where the matter is contracted between persons of the closest kinship, given in the hearing of a third party of full age, and recollected by the claimant in his particular setting and at his particular hour. The undertaking Sir Bartholomew sets out answers each of the three. I shall ask Sir Bartholomew to lay out the setting and the hour at his own recollection." "Miss Kemble," Sir Bartholomew said. He laid his folded paper flat at the writing table. "I had come over from Northmoor Hall on the morning of Monday the 14th of September, 1818, in my own chaise. I was received by my late cousin, Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, at the south parlour of this house at 3 o'clock that afternoon. I was set at a side chair. My late cousin was at the Broadwood pianoforte at the inner wall of the south parlour. She played through, in the half-hour preceding the matter, the Handel air, "Oh, Praise the Lord with One Consent," from the Oratorio Susanna at the Broadwood, in a most settled performance. At the close of the air she rose, took the chair opposite, and set out at her own settled wish that the half of Itchenstoke should at her death pass to my own hand. That is the matter, Miss Kemble, set out at my own recollection. Mr. Lanesborough inclined at his elbow. "Miss Kemble, the matter is set out. You shall answer." Lavinia Kemble laid her hand at the inner edge of the writing table. She inclined at Mr. Penlow at her right. She inclined at Reverend Carberry at her left. She drew the dark calf Walsh, 1787 Volume 5 at her right hand, and the dark calf Walsh, 1787 Volume 6 at her left, and she laid each open at the writing table at the page of its proper title leaf, and she answered Sir Bartholomew Northmour in the even Hampshire voice she had brought down from the parsonage at Itchenabas the previous Saturday. "Sir Bartholomew, the air, 'Oh, Praise the Lord with One Consent,' is not from Susanna. It is from the Handel funeral anthem of 1737. The Walsh 1787 set on this table will confirm. My late great-aunt's hands had been silent since November 1817 by Mr. Stoddart's restoration record. The matter you set out cannot have been at the moment you set it out." Sir Bartholomew Northmour, at the writing-table opposite, did not at the first moment move. The oily smile did not at the first moment leave the corner of his mouth. He looked down at the open Volume 5 at her right, and he looked down at the open Volume 6 at her left, and he set the thumb of his right hand at the upper margin of his folded paper and let the paper fall a half-inch at the table. He cleared his throat once. He cleared his throat a second time. He set the small linen handkerchief from the inner sleeve at the dampened temple under the brown wig, and lowered it again at the inner pocket. He did not speak. Mr. Lanesborough inclined at his elbow. "Miss Kemble," the barrister said in a thin grey voice that had altered at the second word. I should be much obliged at the laying out of the matter at the table. Lavinia laid the Walsh 1787 Volume 5 flat at the inner middle of the writing table. She set her right hand at the title page. Mr. Lanesborough, the Walsh edition of the Handel Oratorios was published at London in 1787 in 6 volumes. The Walsh Volume 5 contains, at its title leaf, the Handel Oratorio Susanna, composed in 1748 and first performed at Covent Garden the 10th of February 1749. I have at the inner margin the full list of the airs. 27 airs over 3 acts. The air "O Praise the Lord with One Consent" is not among the 27. It is not in the Susanna Oratorio at any point. It was never set by Mr. Handel for any of the 3 Susanna voices at any hour of the composition. The Walsh Volume 5 at this table will confirm at the inner margin of every leaf of the airs. She turned the Volume 5 at the table for Sir Bartholomew Northmore to read at his own hand the 27 airs at the inner margin in her own, settled italic. He did not at the moment look down at the inner margin. He set his thumb at the upper edge of the table and did not speak. She laid the Volume 5 at the inner side and drew the Walsh Volume 6 at the inner middle of the writing table. She opened the Volume 6 at the title page. Mr. Lanesborough, the Walsh Volume 6 contains, at its title leaf, the Handel funeral anthem composed in 1737 for the obsequies of Her Majesty, Queen Caroline of Brandenburg-Ansbach, performed at Westminster Abbey on the 17th of December 1737, and published by Walsh of London the year following. The full text opens at the chorus, "The ways of Zion do mourn," and at the central section is the air, "O Praise the Lord with One Consent." I have at the inner margin my own annotation of the air, dated the spring of 1815. The 2 Handel works were composed 11 years apart. The funeral anthem at 1737, the Susanna at 1748, and they were never combined by Walsh or by any other London publisher at any hour of the 18th century. She turned the Volume 6 at the table. The air opened at the inner margin in her own gentle italic of the spring of 1815. Sir Bartholomew Northmore did not at the moment look down at the inner margin. Mr. Lanesborough inclined a fraction at the table and did look down at the inner margin, and the thin grey mouth altered a second time. He laid his pen at the inner edge of the folio. "Miss Kemble, I am at the matter. Mr. Lanesborough, the air Sir Bartholomew has set out at the writing table, the air he has set out as having been played through by my late great-aunt at the Broadwood at the South Parlour at the afternoon of the 14th of September, 1818, in the half-hour preceding the alleged parole, is the central air of the Handel funeral anthem of 1737. It is not the air of the Susanna Oratorio of 1748. He has set out at this table a Handel air from a Handel work that was at no point in the Susanna Oratorio at any hour of its composition or publication. He has either set out an interview that was never held at this house, or he has set out an interview at which 2 Handel airs from 2 unrelated Handel works were combined in his own recollection at a setting at which he was at no point present. The matter cannot stand at the Walsh 1787 set on this writing table. Mr. Penlow at her right, inclined at the table. Reverend Carberry at her left, inclined at the table. Mr. Inwood at the side desk laid the pen at the foolscap and wrote at the inner middle the words of the Walsh confirmation in his clerk's even round. Sir Bartholomew Northmore, at the writing table opposite, drew the folded paper back at his own hand. The oily smile had at this hour left the corner of his mouth. The gout flush at the cheeks had altered to a slow grey at the temples under the brown wig. He cleared his throat a third time at the writing table. He did not speak. Mr. Lanesborough laid the pen at the inner edge of the folio at the table, and did not lift the pen at the foolscap. Lavinia drew Mr. Stoddart of London's October 1813 restoration certificate from under the small brass paperweight at the inner end of the writing table. She unfolded the certificate at the writing table at her own hand. The certificate was on plain laid paper of the London trade. 2 leaves, the inner leaf bearing the engraved heading, Stoddart and Son, Pianoforte makers and restorers, of No. 11 Wardour Street, Soho, London. It bore the date October the 29th, 1813, and it bore at the foot the signature of Mr. Robert Stoddart in a plain, even hand, and it bore at the lower margin the receipt stamp at 15 guineas paid in full. She laid the certificate flat at the inner middle of the writing table for Mr. Lanesborough's reading. Mr. Lanesborough. Mr. Stoddart of London, at the October of 1813, set out at his Wardour Street restoration certificate that the Broadwood square piano of Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, obtained at London at March 1809, had been restored at his own hand and returned to the South Library at the November of 1813 in full playing condition. At the closing paragraph, which I shall ask you to read, Mr. Stoddart sets out that the action requires an annual tuning at the spring quarter-day and the autumnal quarter-day, Lady Day and Michaelmas, and that the maker would attend at the spring and autumnal quarter-days of every year following. Mr. Lanesborough leaned at the writing table and read the closing paragraph of the restoration certificate at his own hand. The thin grey mouth altered a 3rd time. Mr. Lanesborough, Mr. Stoddart kept his own ledger at Wardour Street, Soho. By the entries Mr. Penlow has obtained from Mr. Stoddart's London office, Mr. Stoddart attended the Broadwood of the South Library at every spring and autumnal quarter-day from 1814 to the Michaelmas of 1817, and not thereafter. He returned to the South Library at the October of 1819, at the particular instruction of Mrs. Cassandra Kemble 4 weeks before her death, to tune the Broadwood a final time. Between the Michaelmas of 1817 and the October of 1819, the Broadwood had not been tuned at any hour. Mr. Stoddart records at the inner leaf of the October 1819 receipt that the keys have not been played for 2 years past. The action is at the inner hammers in the condition of a long silent instrument, and the spring of the dampers requires the full reset. Mr. Lanesborough leaned a 2nd time at the writing table and read the October 1819 receipt at his own hand. Mr. Lanesborough. The Broadwood was silent from the Michaelmas of 1817 to the October of 1819 by Mr. Stoddart's own ledger and receipt. It was silent at the 14th of September, 1818. The keys at which Sir Bartholomew sets out my late great-aunt's hand at the playing-through of any Handel air at that afternoon were silent keys. The reason is set out at Mr. Stoddart's October 1819 receipt. My late great-aunt's hands had at the November of 1817 lost the strength they had had at the spring quarter-day, and she had asked Mrs. Burwood, the housekeeper, to set the Broadwood at a long silent rest until she should ask the maker to tune them at her final hour. She did so ask at the October of 1819. No Handel air was played at the Broadwood at the South Library at any hour of any afternoon of the year 1818. The matter cannot stand at Mr. Stoddart of London's own ledger. Sir Bartholomew Northmore, at the writing table opposite, had at this hour set both his hands flat at the inner edge of the writing table. The grey at the temples had altered to a slow white at the cheekbone. He did not look at Mr. Lanesborough at his right elbow. He did not look at Mr. Penlow. He did not look at Reverend Carberry. He looked down at the closed folded paper at his own hand, and the folded paper at his own hand began to shake a fraction at the upper margin where the thumb of his right hand was set. Mr. Lanesborough laid the pen at the inner edge of the folio at the table for a third time. He did not speak. Lavinia drew the leaf of Reverend Carberry's parish visit book at the inner middle of the writing table. The leaf was a single sheet of plain-laid paper of the parish ledger, ruled in green ink and dated in the curate's plain Winchester hand. She laid it flat at the writing table for Mr. Lanesborough's reading. Mr. Lanesborough, Reverend Carberry of the parish, living of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke-on-the-Itchen, has at his parish visit book of the autumn of 1818 his own entries for the parish visits to Itchenstoke Hall at the autumnal quarter. Reverend Carberry shall read the entries at the writing table at his own hand. Reverend Carberry inclined at his side chair at the writing table. He laid his thin finger at the leaf of the parish visit book. He read in his plain Winchester voice. Tuesday the 8th of September, 1818, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Parish visit to Mrs. Cassandra Kemble of Itchenstoke Hall at the South Bedchamber. Dr. Wickham of Winchester has attended that morning at 11:30 on the matter of the autumnal influenza Mrs. Kemble has taken at the Sunday last. Dr. Wickham sets the confinement at a fortnight at the South Bedchamber. Mrs. Kemble at the present hour at the South Bedchamber, sitting up at the inner chair, in the gentle Hampshire composure of her own settled hand. Reverend Carberry at the South Bedchamber at her own request. Prayer read at the Book of Common Prayer at the order for the visitation of the sick. Tuesday the 15th of September, 1818, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Parish visit to Mrs. Cassandra Kemble of Itchenstoke Hall at the South Bedchamber. Dr. Wickham at the morning visit at 11:30. Mrs. Kemble at the present hour at the South Bedchamber, confined. The autumnal influenza at its 8th day. Dr. Wickham sets the matter at the further 7 days. Mrs. Kemble at the inner chair, in the lace cap and the dark grey wool gown of her confinement, in the gentle Hampshire composure. Reverend Carberry at the South Bedchamber at her own request. Prayer read at the order for the visitation of the sick. Mrs. Burwood at the inner door at the side tray. Tuesday, the 22nd of September, 1818, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Parish visit to Mrs. Cassandra Kemble of Itchenstoke Hall at the South Bedchamber. Dr. Wickham at the morning visit at 11:30. The autumnal influenza at its 15th day. Dr. Wickham sets the matter at the close. Mrs. Kemble at the South Bedchamber at her own request. The lace cap, the dark grey wool gown. Reverend Carberry at the South Bedchamber. Prayer read at the office of thanksgiving for the recovery from sickness. Reverend Carberry laid the leaf flat at the writing table at the inner middle and set his thin finger at the lower margin where the parish clerk, Mr. Hollins of St. Mary's Vestry, had countersigned each Tuesday entry at the same green ink at the parish ledger. Mr. Lanesborough, he said in his plain Winchester voice, I attended Mrs. Cassandra Kemble at the South Bedchamber of Itchenstoke Hall at every Tuesday and Friday of the fortnight of the 8th to the 22nd of September, 1818. Dr. Wickham of Winchester attended every morning of the same fortnight. The autumnal influenza had at the 8th of September, 1818, confined Mrs. Kemble to her own South Bedchamber, and she did not, at any hour of the fortnight, come down to the south parlour, or to the south library, or to any other room of the ground floor of the house. The matter that Sir Bartholomew Northmore has set out at this writing table, the playing through of the Handel air at the Broadwood Square piano at the south parlour at the afternoon of Monday the 14th of September, 1818, could not have been at that afternoon, nor at any afternoon of the fortnight at either side of that afternoon. Mrs. Kemble was at the South Bedchamber. She was not at the south parlour. She was not at the Broadwood. She was not at any afternoon of the not at the Broadwood. She was not at any oratorio of Mr. Handel, of any year of any volume of the Walsh 1787 edition. The matter cannot have been at the moment Sir Bartholomew has set out. Mr. Lanesborough, at the writing table opposite, laid both his hands at the inner edge of the folio. He did not lift the pen. He did not at the second moment speak. He looked down at the leaf of the parish visit book at the inner middle of the writing table. And then he looked down at the Walsh 1787 Volume 5 and the Walsh 1787 Volume 6, laid open at the inner side and the inner side. And then he looked down at Mr. Stoddart's October 1813 Restoration Certificate and the October 1819 Final Tuning Receipt at the inner end of the writing table. And the thin grey mouth altered a fourth time. Sir Bartholomew Northmour, at the writing table opposite, gout-flushed no longer, the brown wig sitting a quarter-inch back on the dampened temples, drew his folded paper back at his own hand a second time. The paper at his hand shook a full half-inch at the upper margin. He cleared his throat a fourth time. He cleared his throat a fifth. He set the folded paper at the inner pocket of the bottle-green morning coat. He laid both his hands flat at the writing table, and he did not lift them. He looked once at Mr. Lanesborough, at his elbow. The barrister did not look back. Sir Bartholomew Northmour rose at the writing table. The chair at his hand scraped the elm board at the south library floor. He laid his hand at the back of the chair to steady himself. He inclined at Mr. Penlow at the inner side of the table, and Mr. Penlow inclined a fraction in return. He inclined at Reverend Carberry, and the curate inclined a fraction in return. He did not incline at Lavinia. He turned at the south library door, and at the panelled threshold he laid his hand at the door frame for a second moment of steadying. And then he passed through into the panelled hall, and Mr. Aubrey at the south door saw him into the chaise. Mr. Lanesborough at the writing table did not at the first moment rise. He laid the pen at the inner edge of the folio for the fourth time, and at the inner edge of the folio he set the lid of the small steel ink bottle. He closed the folio at the writing table at his own hand. He drew the black leather strap at the outer edge and buckled the folio at the inner notch. "Miss Kemble," he said in a thin grey voice that had at the fifth moment altered to a plain, even Winchester quietness, "I shall not at this hour press the matter at any further setting. I shall withdraw the parole trust claim at Lincoln's Inn this evening, at the post to my own chambers. The matter at the Walsh 1787 set on this writing table, and the matter at Mr. Stoddart's Restoration Record, and the matter at Reverend Carberry's Parish Visit Book, the three together cannot be set against. I am much obliged at your own composure at the laying out at this table." He rose at his own hand. He laid the folio at his arm. He inclined at Mr. Penlow at the inner side of the table. "Mr. Penlow." "Mr. Lanesborough." He inclined at Reverend Carberry. "Reverend Carberry." "Mr. Lanesborough." He inclined at Lavinia at the inner middle of the writing table. "Miss Kemble, I am at your hand." "Mr. Lanesborough." Mr. Lanesborough at the south library door at the panelled threshold inclined a second time and passed through into the panelled hall, and Mr. Aubrey at the south door saw him into the chaise after Sir Bartholomew, and the chaise rolled out at the south drive at the gravel, and at the inner curve at the chalk stream bridge it was lost at the hedge of the home pasture. Mr. Penlow at the writing table laid his hand at the inner edge of the foolscap that Mr. Inwood at the side desk had at the close of the matter written up in his own clerk's hand. He inclined at Mr. Inwood, and the clerk laid the foolscap at the folio at the inner end of the writing table, and rose and set the small steel ink bottle at the inner pocket of his dark grey coat. Mr. Penlow drew the foolscap at his own hand and read at the inner middle the clerk's record of the matter, and inclined. "Miss Kemble," Mr. Penlow said in his plain, even Winchester voice, "the matter is settled. The handle has settled it." Lavinia laid her own hand at the inner edge of the Walsh 1787 Volume 6, at the inner middle of the writing table, at the page of the air, "Oh, praise the Lord with one consent," at the inner margin of her own gentle italic of the spring of 1815. She did not at the first moment answer. She inclined at Mr. Penlow and at Reverend Carberry in the gentle Hampshire composure she had brought down from the parsonage at Itchen Abbas. Mr. Penlow, Reverend Carberry, I am much obliged at your hands. The Walsh 1787 set shall stand at this writing table at the South Library at every Wednesday afternoon at 4, and at no other hour shall the matter of Sir Bartholomew Northmore be set out at this house again. Mr. Penlow inclined. Reverend Carberry inclined. Mr. Inwood at the side desk laid the fool's cap at the folio, and rose and bowed, and laid the folio at the side table at the inner side of the South Library door. Mrs. Burwood at the inner panelled threshold, who had been at the inner side of the side table at the close of the matter, came up at the writing table and laid the small silver tray with the 4 small Worcester porcelain cups of the south parlour at the inner middle of the table. She poured the tea at her own settled hand from the small silver Hampshire pot. The South Library at Itchenstoke Hall, at the writing table at the inner middle, lay quiet at the gentle grey winter light of the Wednesday afternoon. The Walsh 1787, Handel's 6 volumes lay open at the writing table at the inner side. Mr. Stoddart's October 1813 Restoration Certificate lay flat at the inner end. The leaf of Reverend Carberry's Parish Visit Book lay at the inner middle. Mrs. Burwood's small silver Hampshire pot stood at the inner middle at her own settled hand. The Broadwood square piano at the inner south wall, that had been silent from the November of 1817 to the October of 1819 by Mr. Stoddart's ledger, and that had at the October of 1819 been tuned a final time at the late great-aunt's own particular request 4 weeks before her death, stood now under its plain holland cover at the gentle silence it had kept. It would be lifted at the Saturday afternoon following, in the gentle Hampshire fashion the late great-aunt had set out in the sealed letter at the South Library writing table at the soft Hampshire afternoon of the 4th of November 1819, and the Handel air, O praise the Lord with one consent, the central air of the funeral anthem of 1737, would be played through, for the first time at the South Library since the autumnal quarter-day of 1817, by the next hand at the Broadwood, in the gentle Hampshire fashion of the Itchenstoke chalk stream parishes. That was for the Saturday following. The Wednesday at the writing table was now settled. The Handel had settled it. The late January at Itchenstoke settled into a careful rhythm that took Lavinia between the South Library at the Hall and the parsonage at Itchen Abbas, 6 miles west. She kept Wednesdays at the parsonage with her widowed father, the Reverend Augustus Kemble, who was now in his 63rd year, and who held the curacy of St. Swithins of Itchen Abbas as he had since 1798. She kept Thursdays for the Itchenstoke parish poor with Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys. She kept Fridays for the home pastor accounts with Mr. Sandys at the steward's strong cupboard. She kept Saturdays for the parish school music class at the South Library at the 1809 Broadwood. She kept Sundays for St. Mary's at the south porch of Itchenstoke and the rectory tea following with the Reverend Carberry. She kept Mondays and Tuesdays for the South Library writing table and the careful annotation of her Walsh 1787 Handel 6 volumes and the Breitkopf 1800 Haydn creation in the gentle Hampshire fashion that the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble had kept in her own day. In the first week of February, Mrs. Burwood at the Brick Hob proposed Miss Damaris Burwood, her niece of 24 at Easton Parish, as reading companion to the new mistress of Itchenstoke. Miss Damaris Burwood was a small, fair, Easton-bred young woman of plain dark wool and a settled honesty, and Lavinia accepted her at the South Library on the Thursday following. Miss Damaris took up her reading at the South Library window in the afternoons of the Mondays and the Tuesdays, sitting at the small dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Kemble had kept at the south wall, and she read aloud from the Reverend Mr. Henry Hart Milman's Fall of Jerusalem of 1820 and from Miss Hannah More's Practical Piety of 1811, in the plain Eastern-bred reading voice her aunt had set her to from her own girlhood. Lavinia, at the South Library writing table, laid her Walsh 1787 Volume 4 at the writing table and listened to the reading at the gentle Hampshire afternoon hour, and the matter of the reading companion was settled at the South Library in the careful manner of the late Mrs. Kemble's own day. The 6 Itchenstoke village girls of the Saturday music class were named once at Reverend Carberry's parish school list in the South Library hand of Lavinia herself: Hetty Aubrey, at 12, the butler's youngest daughter; Patience Sandys, at 13, the steward's eldest; Letitia Carberry, at 11, the curate's middle child; Faith Penlow, at 14, the Winchester solicitor's grandniece at her aunt's at the village; Sophie Lanesborough, at 12, the schoolmistress's daughter, no relation to the Andover barrister; and Bryony Menwaring, at 13, a remote cousin of the lay patron's house, lodging with her aunt at the smithy. These were the 6 who came over from the village on the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the gentle Hampshire spring. The parish school music class at the South Library on the Saturday afternoons was, in Lavinia's own settled understanding of the matter, the chief expansion of her late great-aunt's settled wish. She had the 6 village girls at the South Library at the 1809 Broadwood from the early afternoon through the close of the afternoon, and she taught them, in the careful Hampshire fashion of Mr. Vincent Novello, of the Spanish Embassy Chapel at London, the Handel Hallelujah Chorus from Volume 4 of the Walsh 1787 set, and the Haydn Opening Chorus, and God Said from the Breitkopf 1800 creation. She set Hetty Aubrey and Patience Sandys at the alto line, Letitia Carberry and Faith Penlow at the treble, and Sophie Lanesborough and Bryony Menwaring at the second treble, and she played the Broadwood herself at the bass line, and the 6 village girls of the Itchenstoke parish school stood at the South Library window in a half-circle, and gave back the Handel and the Haydn in a careful Hampshire blend that Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's door heard with a settled satisfaction. The class closed at the close of the afternoon, with Mrs. Burwood bringing in the milk and honey at the brick hob, and the 6 girls walking back at Mr. Sandys's careful direction at the home pasture path to the village. Lavinia, at the South Library writing table at the close of each Saturday, set down in her green calf music journal the air the 6 village girls had taken at the music class hour, and the small Itchenstoke parish school music class register the Reverend Carberry had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the second Sunday of January was kept at the South Library writing table at the plain Hampshire fashion the late Mrs. Kemble had kept of her own parish school accounts at the Itchenstoke, living in her own day. The parish school music class at the South Library at the Broadwood on the Saturday afternoons, through the late winter and the early spring, took up the Handel Hallelujah Chorus and the Haydn Opening Chorus, and God Said at the 26 Saturday hours from the second Saturday of January through the last Saturday of April, and by the close of the April, the 6 village girls of the Itchenstoke parish had the Handel Hallelujah at the alto and treble lines at a plain Hampshire reading, and the Haydn Opening Chorus at the second treble at a settled plain reading also. Mr. Sandys walked the home pasture at his usual careful rounds through the late February and the early March, and reported the lambing at the South Meadow as fair for the year. The Reverend Augustus Kemble, at the Itchenabas parsonage, received Lavinia at the South Parlour at each Wednesday of the late January and the February and the March, in the plain Hampshire reserve he had kept these 28 years, since the death of his late wife, Mrs. Sarah Kemble, in the spring of 1812, and he asked of his daughter the small Itchenabas parish accounts she had kept for him these 15 years past at the parsonage writing table, and Lavinia at the South Parlour gave him the accounts in the settled plain manner of the parsonage of her own girlhood. The small Clementi pianoforte of 1812 stood at the south parlour at the south wall, as it had stood these 8 years, and Lavinia at the Wednesday calls did not play through the Clementi at the south parlour after the Acis and Galatea air of the Wednesday of the 22nd of December 1819, the air being the last she had finished at Ichenabas. The Reverend Augustus at the south parlour did not press the matter at the Wednesday calls, and the small Clementi at the south parlour stood silent at the south wall in the plain Hampshire fashion of the parsonage of the late Mrs. Sarah Kemble's own day. The Itchenstoke parish poor at the Thursdays of the late January, through the March received Lavinia at the parish poor visits with Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys, in the plain Hampshire fashion the late Mrs. Kemble had kept at the Itchenstoke parish these many years past. Lavinia at the parish poor visits carried at her hand the small Kemble pewter-stamped parish poor purse of the late Mrs. Kemble's own keeping, and the small Itchenstoke parish poor account book the Reverend Carberry had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the 2nd Sunday of January, and she settled the parish poor matters at the small village cottages of the Itchenstoke chalk stream meadows at the plain Hampshire, reckoning the late Mrs. Kemble had kept in her own day. Mrs. Burwood, at the housekeeper's keys at the cottage thresholds 3 paces behind Lavinia, at the parish poor visits, gave the village mothers a plain settled Itchenstoke hall, greeting in the plain Hampshire fashion of the chalk stream parishes, and the matter of the parish poor visits was settled at the Itchenstoke parish in the plain Hampshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Kemble's own day. The Wednesday of the 22nd of March, 1820 came in upon Itchenstoke with the soft Hampshire light of an early spring afternoon at the South Library window, and Lavinia, at the South Library writing table, opened her late great-aunt's annotated copy of the Walsh 1787 Handel Volume 4 at the Messiah page, and turned to the trumpet air. The trumpet shall sound at page 89. She had not before opened this page of the late great-aunt's own copy, having read the trumpet air through her own Walsh set at the Ichenabas south parlour these 4 years past. Mrs. Cassandra Kemble had made annotations on the trumpet air page in her own gentle italic hand. There were annotations on the ornament at the close of the first section, annotations on the pedal bass at the entry of the trumpet, annotations on the suggested tempo at the largo, annotations at the foot of the page in the careful, Oxford-quality hand the Reverend Carberry had spoken of at the rectory tea of the Sunday past, and one marginal note at the lower right of the page in a slightly later gentle italic that Lavinia read through twice at the South Library writing table. This Christmas Eve of 1810, my niece Mrs. Sarah Kemble, Lavinia's mother, came over from Ichenabas with Lavinia, then 18 months, and I played the trumpet air at the South Library for the child, who reached out to the Broadwood keys as the air closed. Lavinia shall play this trumpet air in her own time. C.K. Lavinia had not known her late great-aunt had played the trumpet air for her at 18 months. She had not known her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Kemble, had come over from Ichenabas with her in the 18-month babyhood of 1810 to the South Library at Itchenstoke. She had not been told. Her late mother had been taken in the spring of 1812, in the 3rd year of Lavinia's life, and her father, the Reverend Augustus Kemble, had not, in his widowed Hampshire reserve at the parsonage, spoken of the matter in the 28 years following. The matter of the 18-month Christmas Eve at the South Library at the Broadwood had been at her late mother's hand in the plain Hampshire reserve of the Ichenabas parsonage, and the matter had been at her late great-aunt's hand at the South Library at Itchenstoke, at the marginal note in the Walsh 1787 Volume 4 at page 89, and the matter had not been at Lavinia's own hand at her own girlhood at Ichenabas these 28 years past. Lavinia closed the volume at the marginal note. She stood at the South Library window, in the plain Hampshire light of the early spring afternoon, in a settled silence of 10 minutes. The south library window gave at the home pasture and the chalk stream meadow and the apple and pear orchard at the east in the plain Hampshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Kemble's own day, and the plain Hampshire light of the early spring afternoon stood at the South Library writing table at the Walsh, 1787, Volume 4, at the marginal note in Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's gentle italic. Mrs. Burwood at the brick hob in the kitchen at the south passage was silent at the housekeeper's keys. The 1809 Broadwood at the South Library stood silent at the south wall. Lavinia did not play through the trumpet air at the South Library this evening. She set the Walsh, 1787, Volume 4, on the South Library writing table at the marginal note, and laid Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's annotation pencil at the page. She should play the trumpet air at the Broadwood at the South Library, for her own child at her own time, in her own settled understanding of her late great-aunt's settled wish, and not before. The matter of the trumpet air at the South Library at the Broadwood was settled at the South Library writing table at the Walsh, 1787, Volume 4, at the marginal note at the close of the Wednesday afternoon of the 22nd of March in the plain Hampshire reckoning of the chalk stream parishes. The Wednesday of the 12th of April brought the Reverend Carberry over from the rectory to the South Library tea, and he confirmed, in his careful Hampshire reserve at the South Library window, that Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, in her last conversation at her south bedchamber in the November of 1819, had asked him to bring my small parsonage candle, the late Mrs. Kemble's own settled name for Lavinia at the Itchenabas parsonage these many years past, the 1810 Christmas Eve annotation at the Walsh, 1787, Volume 4, page 89, with my settled asking pardon. The Reverend Carberry had meant to speak of the matter at the South Library at the close of January, and had let the Itchenabas to Itchenstoke settling and the Sir Bartholomew Northmore matter of the South Library at the Wednesday of the 19th of January pass first. He asked Lavinia's pardon for the plain Hampshire delay. The Reverend Carberry observed at the South Library window, in his plain Itchenstoke parish curate's manner, that the late Mrs. Kemble had, at the south bedchamber, asked him to lay the matter at Lavinia's hand at the South Library at the parish curate's own settled discretion, and that she had asked him further to say at the South Library, in her own settled wording at the south bedchamber, that the 28 Hampshire chalk stream, miles between Itchenabas and Itchenstoke, had been at her hand to bridge from the spring of 1812 onward, the spring of Mrs. Sarah Kemble's death, that she had not, in the matter of the Reverend Octavius Kemble of Andover and the parting of 1788, brought herself to the bridge, and that the trumpet air at the Walsh, 1787, Volume 4, page 89, the trumpet air she had played at the South Library for Lavinia in the 18-month babyhood at the Christmas Eve of 1810, was the trumpet air she had meant the small parsonage candle to play at the South Library Broadwood in her own time. Lavinia received the Reverend Carberry's confirmation at the South Library window in her own settled silence, and asked the Reverend Carberry to take the South Library tea in the plain Hampshire fashion that her late great-aunt had kept at the South Library on the rectory tea Wednesdays of her own day, Mrs. Burwood, at the brick hob at the South Passage, laying the small Kemble tea service of 1791 at the South Library writing table, and the rectory tea of the Wednesday of the 12th of April was taken at the South Library window in the plain Hampshire fashion of the chalk stream parishes. Lady Day Quarter Day at the 25th of March brought Mr. Sandys to the South Library writing table with the home pasture accounts and the steward's strong cupboard rentals settled at the plain Hampshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Kemble's own books, the rentals of the 7 Itchenstoke chalk stream parish tenancies at the home pasture and the apple and pear orchard, and the south meadow brought up at the plain steward's hand of his 35 years at the Itchenstoke living. In the middle of April, Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys brought up the Kemble family pearls, a single strand of small Winchester-set river pearls of 1789 in a worn, dark calf case. The Kemble pearls Sir Hadrian Kemble had set at the Winchester goldsmiths for his bride Mrs. Cassandra Kemble at the spring of 1789. The pearls Mrs. Kemble had kept at the upper press at the South Landing through her widowhood of 1811 to 1819, and laid them on the South Library writing table at Lavinia's own settled wish. The Wednesday of the 12th of April at the South Library, at the close of the music class hour, the 6 village girls presented Lavinia at the South Library window with a small calf-bound wildflower album of the Hampshire chalk-stream meadows the 6 girls had gathered through the early spring at the South Meadow and the apple and pear orchard, and the village schoolmistress, Mrs. Penlow Tewkesbury's own well-used copy of Mr. Croxall's 1722 Aesop's Fables in plain Winchester, woolcloth at the cover. By the late April, the half-mourning at Itchenstoke had eased by the gentle Hampshire reckoning of the 4 months past the November of 1819, and Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys produced from the late Mrs. Kemble's South Press at the upper landing a cream and peach sprigged muslin morning gown of the Winchester dressmaker's hand of 1818 that Mrs. Kemble had not lived to take into wear. Lavinia took the muslin into wear at the South Library at the close of the month, in the gentle Hampshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day, the unrelieved black gabardine set by at the upper press. Easter Sunday at the 23rd of April. 1820 came in upon Itchenstoke on the Itchen in the soft Hampshire light of the late April morning at St. Mary's. Reverend Carberry preached the Easter sermon from the Epistle of the Morning, in his plain Hampshire fashion, at the south pulpit of St. Mary's. Mr. Aubrey at the south porch had received the parish at the south door of the church in the early morning, and Mrs. Burwood at the Itchenstoke pew at the south aisle had laid the Kemble pew cushions at the dark oak. Lavinia at the Itchenstoke pew in her cream and peach sprigged muslin, and her late mother's small silver locket at the inner pocket of the morning gown, took the parish Easter service in the gentle Hampshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this pew these many years past. After the close of the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Mary's into the soft Hampshire light of the Easter Sunday late morning, and Reverend Carberry at the south porch inclined to a tall, lean, honey-fawn-coated gentleman who had stood at the rear of the south aisle through the service, and who had come forward at the close to the south porch. The 5th Viscount Mainwaring was tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, warm hazel eyes the colour of Hampshire chalk-stream water at autumn, gentle firm mouth, weathered fair Oxford train skin, the Mainwaring Viscounty signet on his right hand, honey-fawn morning coat over cream waistcoat. Reverend Carberry at the south porch inclined to Lavinia and inclined to his lordship, and made the introduction in his settled Hampshire fashion verbatim at the south porch of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke on the Itchen. Miss Kemble, his lordship, Wilfrid Algernon Mainwaring, 5th Viscount Mainwaring, of Mainwaring Park 6 miles east on the Hampshire chalk stream above Easton. Lord Wilfrid is the lay patron of the Itchenstoke living, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Musicians these 5 years past. Lord Wilfrid, at the south porch, inclined to Lavinia in the Oxford-trained Hampshire fashion of the chalk-stream parishes. He observed, at the south porch, in his settled plain manner, that he had known the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble from the year of his own coming down to Mainwaring Park in 1812 through to her last autumn of 1819 as the considered Hampshire pianist of the chalk-stream parishes. That Mrs. Kemble's settled understanding of the Handel oratorios and the Haydn creation had been the chief musical observation of the chalk-stream country for the 8 years he had been at the lay patronage of the Itchenstoke living. He observed that at the parish school inspection of the September of 1819, the Reverend Carberry had laid at his hand at the rectory study one of Mrs. Kemble's own annotation pages from the Walsh 1787 Volume 4 Trumpet Air, and that he had at the time remarked at the Reverend Carberry's hand the Oxford quality observation of the annotation, the cross-reference Mrs. Kemble had set down to the parallel pedal bass at the Haydn opening chorus, and God said, the suggested largo at the trumpet entry, and the marginal note at the Italian ornament at the close of the first section that Lord Wilfrid had not before seen at any of the Hampshire, Chalkstream parish pianists' hands. He observed, in his plain Hampshire manner at the south porch, that he had not, in his 8 years, at the lay patronage of the Itchenstoke, living expected to see that hand continue at the South Library, Broadwood, after the November of 1819, and that the matter of the parish school music class at the South Library at the Broadwood at the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the early spring had been brought to his hand at the rectory by the Reverend Carberry at the 3 Sunday rectory teas past. He had heard at the south porch from Reverend Carberry these 3 Sunday mornings past of the parish school music class at the South Library at the Broadwood on the Saturday afternoons, of the Handel Hallelujah chorus, and the Haydn opening chorus the new mistress of Itchenstoke had set the 6 village girls at, and had wished to make his settled inquiry of the new mistress of Itchenstoke at the south porch of St. Mary's at the Easter Sunday following. He observed further at the south porch, in his Oxford-trained Hampshire manner, that his own privately printed notes on the Handel oratorios at Mainwaring Park of the year 1816, in 49 pages of his own Mainwaring Park hand, had been at his writing table these 4 years past, and had not before found a Hampshire Chalkstream reader of the Walsh 1787 set, of the considered understanding the late Mrs. Kemble had kept in her own day. Lavinia at the south porch in her cream and peach sprigged muslin, and her late mother's small silver locket at the inner pocket, received Lord Wilfrid's settled observation in the gentle Hampshire fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day at this porch. She inclined to his lordship in the careful manner of the Itchenabas parsonage of her own girlhood. She replied at the south porch in her own settled trait, in the plain Hampshire manner of the Chalkstream parishes. Lord Wilfrid. The Broadwood at Itchenstoke I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Wilfrid at the south porch inclined to Lavinia at the close of her sentence, in the Oxford-trained Hampshire fashion that the Chalkstream parishes had known of the lay patron of the Itchenstoke, living these 8 years past, and observed that he was glad of the matter, and that he should hope to make his settled call at the South Library at Itchenstoke at the Tuesday following the close of Easter week, if the new mistress of the hall should receive him at the South Library at the gentle Hampshire hour the late Mrs. Kemble had kept for her own Tuesday calls in her own day. Lavinia at the south porch in the gentle Hampshire light of the Easter Sunday. Late morning inclined to Lord Wilfrid, and replied that she should receive Lord Wilfrid at the South Library at the Tuesday call. The late great-aunt had kept in her own day, and the matter at the south porch was settled in the plain Hampshire fashion of the Chalkstream parishes. Reverend Carberry at the south porch walked Lavinia and Lord Wilfrid to the lych gate of St. Mary's at the south churchyard wall, where the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's plain Winchester set memorial stone of 1819 stood at the south wall at the third grave from the lych gate in the gentle Hampshire fashion the Chalkstream parishes had kept of the Kemble family these many years past. Lord Wilfrid at the lych gate took his leave of Reverend Carberry and of Lavinia in the Oxford-trained Hampshire fashion, inclining to the lay patron's own settled understanding of the matter, and walked at the south churchyard path to the Mainwaring carriage that had stood at the rectory wall through the close of the service. Lavinia, at the lych gate, took her own leave of Reverend Carberry in the plain Hampshire fashion of the Chalkstream parishes, and walked back at the Hampshire South Churchyard path to the south door of Itchenstoke Hall, Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys, 3 paces behind in her plain plum bombazine and her settled lace cap, in the soft Hampshire light of the Easter Sunday, late morning at the close of the parish service. The south churchyard path from the lych gate of St. Mary's to the south door of Itchenstoke Hall took the half-mile of Hampshire chalk-stream meadow at the south edge of the Itchen, past the small footbridge at the south meadow and the apple and pear orchard at the east of the home pasture. In the plain Hampshire fashion, the Kemble family had walked at the Easter Sundays of these many years past. Lavinia, at the south door of Itchenstoke Hall, inclined to Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys at the close of the half-mile, and Mrs. Burwood, at the housekeeper's keys at the south door, took the cream and peach sprigged muslin bonnet at the inner hall in the plain Hampshire fashion of the late Mrs. Kemble's own day. The Itchenstoke parish Easter Sunday at the south door of the hall was at the close in the settled Hampshire fashion of the chalk-stream parishes, and the matter of the south porch at the lych gate at St. Mary's at the Easter Sunday of the 23rd of April was settled at Itchenstoke at the plain Hampshire reckoning of the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's own settled wish. Saturday, the 6th of May, 1820 was a fair Hampshire morning at Itchenstoke Hall, the chalk stream of the Itchen running low and bright at the south meadow, the apple and pear orchard at the east in its first late blossom. Lavinia Kemble was at the South Library at the Broadwood Square piano, with the Walsh 1787 Handel Volume 4 open at page 89, the trumpet air, and her own pencil in her right hand at the margin. Mr. Aubrey at the south door brought up the calling card at the late morning hour. Lord Wilfrid Algernon Mainwaring, 5th Viscount Mainwaring of Mainwaring Park, was at the south steps with his party. The party at the south door was 4. Lord Wilfrid in honeyfawn morning coat over cream waistcoat, the Mainwaring Viscounty signet at his right hand, Lady Cordelia Mainwaring, 8 years old, soft auburn hair plaited with peach ribbons, hazel eyes her father's, peach and cream sprigged muslin at his left. His elder married sister, Lady Margaret Mainwaring Yelverton, 40, dark hair under a small French lace cap, morning grey poplin half eased to lavender at the cuffs. Her husband, Mr. Marmaduke Yelverton, 44, plain dark wool, kind grey eyes, the Yelverton fob at his waistcoat. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring, 68, slight in plum bombazine, silvered hair under a fine cap, the Mainwaring pearls at her throat. Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys received them at the small east hall in her plum bombazine and the lace cap she had kept these 18 years at Itchenstoke. She had sent down for the silver tea service at Mr. Aubrey's first nod, and the parlour-maid Hetty had laid the south library at the south windows in the careful Hampshire fashion. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring was seated at the east fireside chair, the elder Yelverton lady at the south window seat, Mr. Yelverton at the east bookcase, Lord Wilfrid at the centre rug, and Lady Cordelia at the Broadwood with her small hands folded at the keys in the gentle deference of a well-taught child. Tea was poured by Lavinia at the south library tea-table, Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's stool at her right. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring took her tea with a single lump and no milk, in the old style. Lady Margaret took milk and no sugar. Mr. Yelverton took both. Lord Wilfrid took neither, in the abstemious habit of his Oxford days. Lady Cordelia took milk and water in a small cup that Mrs. Burwood had thought to bring up from the nursery cupboard, the cup having served Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's own great-niece visits of years past. The talk at the South Library was of the parish school music class, of the Easter porch introduction at St. Mary's 3 Sundays prior, of the long fair Hampshire spring at the chalk stream. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring observed that she had known the late Mrs. Cassandra Kemble these 40 years, and had thought her annotation pages, the finest in the Hampshire chalk-stream parishes. She was very glad to see the South Library Broadwood at the hand of the great niece. Lavinia inclined her head in the quiet thanks of a great niece, who knew the compliment was given at its proper weight. Lord Wilfrid, having taken his tea and set the cup at the silver tray, came at last to the matter he had brought his party over the 6 Hampshire miles to bring. He had at Mainwaring Park, he said, the music room at the south corner which had stood neglected since his late wife Lady Alice's death in the November of 1816, the Mainwaring Park Pianoforte, a Broadwood grand of 1807, had been kept in its tune by Mr. Stoddart of London at the annual June visit. But the room itself had wanted a hand to set its scores in their proper order, its lectern at its proper light, its small east cabinet of Lady Alice's Italian songs at its proper arrangement. He should be very gratified, he said, if Miss Kemble would consider laying out the Mainwaring Park music room over the coming May and June at such Tuesday mornings as should suit her at Itchenstoke. He would be content to wait on her judgment at every particular. Lavinia, at the South Library window, inclined her head and said she should be glad to consider the matter, at Mrs. Burwood's chaperonage and at her father Reverend Augustus Kemble's settled approval. Lady Cordelia, at the Broadwood, lifted her small hazel eyes to Lavinia and asked, in the grave courtesy of an 8-year-old at her father's elbow, if she might help with the Handel Hallelujah at the parish school music class on a Saturday afternoon. Lavinia inclined her head and said the parish school music class would be glad of Lady Cordelia's hand at the Broadwood at any Saturday afternoon. Her father might bring her over. The party at Itchenstoke withdrew at the close of the morning. Lord Wilfrid, at the south door, took his leave at the Hampshire fashion, with a small bow at the threshold and a settled look at the South Library window, where Lavinia stood at Mrs. Burwood's right hand. The Tuesday calls began on Tuesday the 9th of May at the South Library at the late morning hour. Mrs. Burwood was at the brick hob with her work-basket through the hour. Reverend Augustus Kemble, having come over the 6 Hampshire chalk-stream miles from Itchenabas parsonage at the second sash window of the South Library, sat at the east bookcase with his Greek Testament open at Romans. Lord Wilfrid brought over his privately printed 1816 notes on the Handel oratorios at Mainwaring Park, Mainwaring 49 pages, dark calf, his own monogram at the spine, printed in 12 copies for the Royal Society of Musicians in the year of Lady Alice's death, and never circulated beyond the Hampshire parishes. They read at the South Library, reading lectern through the late morning hour. The Mainwaring notes at one elbow, the Walsh 1787 Handel, 6 volumes at the other. Lord Wilfrid read aloud the section on Susanna. Lavinia, at the second page of his section, set her pencil at the margin and observed that the air, "O praise the Lord with one consent," was not in Susanna at all, but in the funeral anthem of 1737. The Walsh Volume 6 at her elbow would confirm. Lord Wilfrid took the Volume 6 at her hand, read the page, set the notes at his knee, and said he had not in the 4 years since the printing of his notes considered the distinction. He should, he said, correct the matter in his own copy at the South Library that morning, and at his Mainwaring Park copy at the Tuesday following. Lavinia, at the lectern, inclined her head in the quiet of a teacher who has not pressed the point past its weight. The Tuesday calls continued through May, at the South Library at the late morning, Mrs. Burwood at the brick hob, Reverend Augustus at the east bookcase. The Tuesday of the 16th was of Messiah, the trumpet air at page 89 of the Walsh Volume 4, the air the late great-aunt Mrs. Cassandra Kemble had played at the Itchenstoke South Library every Christmas Eve from 1788 to 1817. Lord Wilfrid, at the lectern, took the Volume 4 at her hand, read the page, and observed that he had at Mainwaring Park a small printed copy of the trumpet air at the Italian song cabinet, which Lady Alice had set down at the year of their marriage. He should bring it over, he said, at the Tuesday following, that the 2 copies might be set at the South Library lectern at the same hour. Lavinia inclined her head and said the South Library lectern was at his service. The Tuesday of the 23rd was of Israel in Egypt, the choruses of the plagues at the Volume 2, which Lord Wilfrid had set out at 4 pages of his notes at his Mainwaring Park, summer of 1815. He read his own 4 pages aloud at the lectern. Lavinia at the second sash window listened, her pencil at the margin, and at the close of the reading observed that the chorus, "He gave them hailstones for rain," was at the same Italian compositional descent as the Susanna chorus he had earlier misattributed. The Handel had borrowed from himself in the Hampshire fashion of every composer of his time. Lord Wilfrid inclined his head and said he had not in his Oxford training been taught the matter at that particular weight. He should set it down at his copy of the notes at the South Library that very afternoon. On the Tuesday of the 23rd of May, at the South Library reading lectern at the late morning, Lavinia at the Israel in Egypt page caught Lord Wilfrid's hazel eyes 1 moment too late at the closing chord of the air she had been reading aloud at the lectern, and the moment hung at the South Library window in the gentle Hampshire silence of a late May noon, before Mrs. Burwood at the brick hob asked at the next breath whether the fire wanted a small log, and the hour settled at its proper closing. The Wednesday walks began on Wednesday the 17th of May at the home pasture southeast corner. Mrs. Burwood walked with them at the dry stone wall as far as the small wicket gate at the orchard, then took her work-basket to the orchard bench at the east, while Lord Wilfrid and Lavinia walked the chalk stream edge at the south meadow. They spoke of the parish school music class, of Lady Cordelia's small hand at the Broadwood, of the Mainwaring Park music room, which Lavinia had begun to lay out at the small Tuesday afternoon at Mainwaring Park the previous week. The Italian songs of Lady Alice's small east cabinet in their proper order at last, the lectern at the south window for the morning light, the Mainwaring Broadwood Grand of 1807 in its summer tuning at Mr. Stoddart's hand. On Wednesday the 7th of June at the home pasture southeast corner, Lord Wilfrid knelt at the dry stone wall at the chalk stream edge and gathered a sprig of Hampshire watermint at the bank. He stood, brushed the chalk from his knee, and gave the sprig to Lavinia in the Hampshire silence he had kept at the orchard wicket 5 paces back. She took the sprig, inclined her head, and placed it at the small linen pouch at her reticule, where the Broadwood cleaning cloth was kept. The Wednesday walks continued through June at the home pasture, at the chalk stream edge, at the orchard bench where Mrs. Burwood sat at her work-basket. The watermint at the linen pouch went between the Broadwood cleaning cloth and the small annotated leaf Lavinia had cut from her own Handel Volume 5 at the South Library that week. On Wednesday the 14th of June, at the East Orchard bench, Mr. Sandys at the home pasture gate inclined his weathered head at Lord Wilfrid in the settled deference of an Itchenstoke steward who had known the Mainwaring Vice-County at the chalk stream parishes these 40 years. On Wednesday the 21st of June, at the chalk stream edge, Lord Wilfrid spoke of Lady Cordelia's small Saturday afternoon hours at the South Library Broadwood. The 8-year-old had been at the parish school music class at the 2nd Saturday of June, at the 3rd Saturday, and at the 4th, and had taken her part at the Handel Hallelujah at the small soprano line Lavinia had set out for her. Lavinia, at the bench at the orchard, said the child had a true ear and a settled hand at the Broadwood, and that the Saturday afternoon hours had been a quiet, weekly pleasure at Itchenstoke. Lord Wilfrid inclined his head and said the matter was very much at his own heart. On the Saturday of the 24th of June, at the South Library after the parish school music class, Lord Wilfrid asked Lavinia if she should permit him to call at Itchenstoke on the Saturday afternoons of July, as well as the Tuesday mornings. Lavinia, at the Broadwood, inclined her head and acquiesced at Mrs. Burwood's settled approval and at her father's continued chaperonage at the East bookcase. The Saturday calls of July were 5: the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, the 29th. The first was at 2 o'clock at the South Library, the parish school music class having ended at the close of the noon hour. Lord Wilfrid brought over at the second Saturday a small-bound score of Lady Alice's own Italian songbook, Lady Alice having been a soprano at the Mainwaring Park music room in her own time, and asked Lavinia to set it at the Italian Song Cabinet at Mainwaring Park at the proper Tuesday. On Saturday, the 5th of August, 1820, at 3 of the afternoon, Lord Wilfrid called at Itchenstoke at the south door. Mr. Aubrey received him. Mrs. Burwood was at the small east closet at the housekeeper's accounts. Reverend Augustus had come over from the parsonage that very afternoon and was at the east bookcase with the Greek Testament at Romans. Lavinia was at the south parlour at the Broadwood. At the south parlour, rather than the south library this Saturday afternoon, at the morning Broadwood cleaning, having taken her to the south parlour Clementi instead. Lord Wilfrid at the south parlour at the centre rug, at the small Persian carpet Lavinia's late great-aunt had laid down in 1812, said his 7 sentences at the gentle Hampshire wait he had brought over the 6 chalk stream miles. Miss Kemble, I have come this Saturday afternoon at the proper hour for a matter I should have wished to bring at no earlier moment than the present one. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have read the gentle italic of your Handel annotations these 4 months, and known by your late great-aunt's 1810 Christmas Eve note that your hand is the next hand at the Itchenstoke Broadwood, to do me the honour of becoming the next Lady Mainwaring. I have spoken at the matter at Mainwaring Park, to my mother the Dowager Lady Mainwaring, to my elder sister Lady Margaret Yelverton, and to Lady Cordelia, who has known her own settled wish at the South Library hour, she has taken with you these 8 Saturdays. I have spoken at the matter at Itchen-Abbas, to your father Reverend Augustus Kemble, at the small north study of the parsonage, Wednesday afternoon last. I shall not press the matter at any moment beyond the present one. I should be very gratified to have your settled answer at the small south parlour, minute at which you are at your ease to give it. Lavinia at the Clementi, her hands at her lap, and her hazel eyes at the small Persian carpet at his feet, took the gentle Hampshire breath the moment had brought her to, and gave her answer at the south parlour clock. Lord Wilfrid, I shall. She lifted her eyes at the second breath, and gave the small Tuesday matter at the close. I shall. And I should be glad of the small Tuesday Broadwood hour at the South Library to continue, by Lady Cordelia's settled wish, even after the wedding bells of Itchenstoke. Lord Wilfrid, at the south parlour rug, inclined his head at the small Persian carpet, and gave his own gentle answer at the next breath. My dear Miss Kemble, I had not, until this Saturday minute at the parlour rug, foreseen the gentle Hampshire quiet at the close of the Tuesday hour shall be the small candle of my own Mainwaring Park evenings to come. I am very gratified by your settled answer. Mrs. Burwood was sent for at the housekeeper's east closet. Reverend Augustus was called from the east bookcase of the South Library. Lady Cordelia, who had come over with her father at the chaise, and had been at the nursery cupboard upstairs with the small cup at her own milk and water, was brought down by Mrs. Burwood at the small north stair. Lady Cordelia, at the south parlour at her father's right hand, took the news at the gravity of an 8-year-old who had known her own settled wish at the Saturday South Library, hours these 8 weeks past. She inclined her small head in the deference her father had taught her at Mainwaring Park, lifted her hazel eyes at Lavinia at the Clementi, and said, in the small voice of a careful 8-year-old, that she should be very glad of a second mother at the South Library Broadwood, and a second mother at the Mainwaring Park music room. Lavinia at the Clementi set her hand at Lady Cordelia's small hand at her elbow, and inclined her head in the quiet thanks of a great-aunt's heir, who had not foreseen the small Saturday hours would bring her so far. The banns were called at St. Mary's of Itchenstoke-on-the-Itchen on the Sundays of the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th of August by Reverend Carberry in his plain black gown at the pulpit, in the careful Hampshire fashion of the parish. Reverend Augustus Kemble came over the 6 chalk stream miles from Itchen Abbas at each of the 3 Sundays, and sat at the front pew at the bride's side of the nave, with his Greek Testament closed at his knee. Mrs. Penlow Tewkesbury, the village dressmaker in plain dark wool, with a small bone thimble at her chain, was sent for at Itchenstoke on the Tuesday of the 15th of August to take the measurements at the South Library for the cream Hampshire muslin morning gown, and returned at the Tuesday following with the small lengths of Hampshire muslin and a settled pattern at the South Library work table. On Saturday, the 9th of September, 1820, at 10 of the morning, at St. Mary's of Itchenstoke-on-the-Itchen, Lavinia Mary Kemble was married to Lord Wilfrid Algernon Mainwaring, 5th Viscount Mainwaring, by Reverend Carberry in his white surplice over his plain black gown. Mr. Penlow of College Street, Winchester, gave the bride away at the chancel step in his plain dark wool and gold spectacles. Reverend Augustus Kemble sat at the front pew at the bride's side of the nave, with his Greek Testament closed at his knee, his hand at the small silver locket of his late wife, Mrs. Sarah Kemble, at his waistcoat pocket. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring and Lady Margaret Yelverton sat at the front pew at the groom's side, Mr. Yelverton at Lady Margaret's right, Lady Cordelia at the Dowager's left in cream and peach sprigged muslin with a small posy of late summer Hampshire watermint at her sash. The bride wore a cream Hampshire muslin morning gown made by Mrs. Penlow Tewkesbury, a sprig of late summer Hampshire watermint, and 1 white and cream rose at the bodice. The Kemble family pearls, Winchester 1789, at the throat, at her late great-aunt Mrs. Cassandra Kemble's settled wish, ivory silk gloves at her hands, and her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Kemble's small silver locket, at the inner pocket of the gown at the heart's side. The wedding breakfast was at the south dining room at Itchenstoke Hall, at the long Hampshire mahogany table Mrs. Cassandra Kemble had set down at her marriage in 1788. Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Sandys at the steward's settled accounts, Mr. Aubrey at the south door. They had laid the south dining room at the Kemble family plate, Winchester 1789, at the careful Hampshire fashion. The Dowager Lady Mainwaring took the place at the bride's right, Reverend Augustus at the groom's left, Lady Cordelia at the bride's left, with her small cup of milk and water at the small plate at her elbow. Lady Margaret Yelverton and Mr. Yelverton took the places at the centre of the long table at Mrs. Burwood's settled arrangement, Mr. Penlow at the foot at the place of the bride's giver-away. Reverend Carberry, in his plain black gown, said the long grace at the head of the table, in the Hampshire fashion of the Itchenstoke parish. The wedding breakfast was of cold roast Hampshire pheasant, and the South Orchard pears at the centre dish, of fresh cream from the Sandys' home pasture at the small jug, of a Madeira from the late great-aunt's cellar at the south door, and of a small Itchenstoke wedding cake Mrs. Burwood and the Itchenstoke kitchen had set down at the long Saturday morning. Lord Wilfrid at the head, his hazel eyes at his bride at his left, gave the small Hampshire toast at the close of the breakfast in the settled phrase his own father had given at his own marriage in 1810. The party rose at the toast. The bride and the bridegroom withdrew at the south door at the small wedding chaise Mr. Aubrey had set at the south drive for the 6 chalk stream miles east to Mainwaring Park. Lady Cordelia, at the south steps, held out her small hand at her father at the chaise step, and inclined her plaited head at her new mother at the chaise window. The chaise drew away at the orchard turn at the south meadow. Mrs. Burwood at the south door inclined her head and went in at the housekeeper's keys. If you have stayed with me to the close of this story, I should be glad of one small word from you in the comments below. Tell me the county or the country you are listening from this evening, and one quiet kindness you have lately received that you have not yet had the chance to repay. If this story has been a comfort to your hour, do press the small bell beside the subscribe ribbon at this channel, so that the next Whispers of Love story shall find you in its turn. Until then, be at your ease, and at your candle, and at your hour. Whispers of Love. On the soft Sunday morning of the 23rd September 1821, in the parish church of St. Mary's of Itchenstoke-on-the-Itchen, a child was christened Cassandra Honoria Mainwaring, daughter of Lord Wilfrid Algernon, Mainwaring 5th Viscount, and of Lavinia Mary, née Kemble, 5th Lady Mainwaring, by the Reverend Carberry, in the Hampshire fashion her grandmother had kept all her days, and her great-grandmother before her. Mrs. Burwood at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Sandys at the home pasture, Mr. Aubrey at the south door. They were all in attendance at the parish christening. The Broadwood Square piano at the South Library stood silent that Sunday morning. The mother shall play through the trumpet air for the daughter at the South Library at the Christmas Eve following. As her own late great-aunt, Mrs. Cassandra Kemble, had played the trumpet air for the mother in her own 18-month babyhood at the Christmas Eve of 1810.